Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Dynamic Dialogue. It's March 9th, and we're going to talk about organizational maturity today. And we're going to talk about that in terms of supply chains and how that relates to supply chains and how you can kind of assess your own organizational maturity. So, as always, this is our bi-weekly series, I guess bi-monthly is more correct, of Dynamic Dialogue. So we meet on the second and fourth Tuesdays of the month. March has a fifth Tuesday, but we will not be meeting on that day. So we're going to stay with the second and fourth format. We do some sharing of ideas. I make a short presentation, open it up for questions and comments. And this link is good through the end of the month, and then there'll be another one for next month. And if you've already subscribed, you'll get automatically subscribed to the next quarter as well. It just kind of cleans up all of my recordings and all of the Zoom and all of the things in to sign up. So maturity models. This is an area of business planning that you'll see frequently. A maturity model is really a framework that helps an organization assess where it is in terms of industry standards, in terms of benchmarking other organization, in terms of really what is possible within an organization. Maturity models help companies appraise their level against a set of standards, and a maturity model really looks at processes. So it's process centric, and it helps you look at how your processes are working with the rest of the organization and how all of that is making your company successful. The focus really is on management capabilities and the capabilities of the staff in order to execute. These types of models really help companies measure their own efficiency and their effectivity, really look at, are we doing the right things, and are we doing those well enough to keep our business moving forward? And the premise of this is that the product and service quality are highly correlated and linked to the processes that you have. If you have robust processes, then that's going to make your quality levels higher of your product and service. And so the maturity model looks at those processes and says, okay, do you have what's needed to be successful? Do you have in place these types of processes, and how robust are they? Um, how broadly do they cover what you're doing, and are you doing enough of them? So business maturity models come in different forms and shapes, and I'm going to look at a couple of them today. The first one I'm going to look at is the capability maturity model, and it's known as CMMI with an integration on the end. This actually began with the Department of Defense, I think back in the 70s. It was crafted around improving software processes. So this is an area where it took off from the beginning of using these processes that were involved with making software to really an enterprise situation. They looked at metrics, they judged a lot of the maturity of an organization through the metrics that they were using it, and they had integrated into their organization. And they added the I when they decided to move past the software to encompass the entire organization. This may be an area that you're familiar with. It's a pretty standard model. A lot of companies use it, especially a lot of defense contractors have CMMI compliance that they're looking at. So there are 5 levels, going from 1, which is the lowest, to 5, which is the highest. And these levels are initial, which has some process controls, a little bit of unpredictable results because your process controls aren't really that good. Number 2, if you assess at that level, you're in the managed area, which means you have processes for projects, but you're still a little more reactive, being more proactive as an organization. The third level, defined, says you have processes for the organization, not just for projects, and you're starting to be more proactive. 4 is the qualitatively managed level, where it says you have processes, and not only do you have those processes, but you measure those processes, you control those processes, and you contribute to the organization in that way. And then finally, 5 at that optimizing level, where you have these processes, you're controlling the processes, and you're going a step further to really focus on process improvement. This is that continuous improvement philosophy and mindset that we want to have in organizations. So when you get to that 5th level of maturity in these business models, that's where you are. So this is a very common one, the CMMI. Another one, a little more recent, was created by Dr. Michael Hammer and first published in the Harvard Business Review in 2007. So this is really comprised of 2 Excel worksheets, which sounds simple enough, but it's pretty detailed. One of these worksheets assesses the maturity of specific business processes. The second one looks at the overall enterprise maturity level. So it's 2 different ways to look at it. It takes a micro level at certain processes, and then it takes a look at the overall enterprise. So this was an important move forward because this let you have really the visibility into what's really working well and what might need some help. So you get to see which processes are strongest and then how that relates to the overall enterprise maturity. So it has 5 topics in the process model, and there's several subsections within that. The enterprise model has 4 topics with actually 13 subtopics, and they both have 13 subtopics. And so we have this, and they have maturity levels for each: P for process, E um, for the enterprise, and they just go 1 through 4, with again 1 being the lowest, 4 being the highest. They also use what we commonly use in business, the red, yellow, green scoring. So if you things are working well, it's green. If it needs some help, it's yellow. And if it's not working or it's broken, then it gets a red score. So I can give you an example of what that looks like. And I know you can't really read this, but you can see that on the left, this is the leadership section. So it's one of the enterprise sections. The other categories in the enterprise section are culture, expertise, and governance. And you can see leadership has 4 sub processes in it: awareness, alignment, behavior, and style. It has 4 levels from E1 to E4 with some wording that gives you an idea of what each of these is. And then there's a scoring area. So what you want to do is to say, if you're strongly in the E3, then you can make E1, 2, and 3 green. That says you're up to there. And then if you maybe started toward 4, you can put a yellow. If you really haven't done anything with that, you can put the red in there. So what you end up with is a stoplight map, if you will, of how you're doing against this maturity model. So this is called the process maturity model, and it's a good way to look at that. So there aren't a lot of supply chain maturity models, and a few years ago, I constructed one with some colleagues of mine, and we based that on the business models we were familiar with, and we began with defining these objectives, these activities, the way that we felt that organizations needed the supply chain function to contribute to that organization overall. So, and we came up with these 8 areas. The first element is the continuum for purchasing to sourcing. And we really define that uh, because we know that every organization needs purchasing. We need the full spectrum of this. But more mature organizations have at least some resources that are charged with conducting broader, deeper, more critical sourcing activities, including doing some market research, cross functional supplier selection, and doing a lot of vendor evaluation of how these suppliers are working. So it's not only just finding the part, getting the part in the door at the right time, but it's actually more toward sourcing as an activity. So companies use that, and then they also use metrics. So companies have metrics for quality, cost, and delivery in supply chain very typically. But what we find is more mature organizations add in metrics for responsiveness. And today, those are turning into flexibility, agility. So, being responsive to you as a customer, being responsive to changes in volumes, to changes in delivery dates, being able to maintain some flow of product in spite of things like pandemics. So that is another metric they've added. Risk and relationship management, there's a number of metrics around those two areas that are included with with companies that are farther down this maturity supply chain. And also, it's possible to evaluate the supplier's use and application of technology, their capacity, their capability. You can put metrics on all of those things and share those with the suppliers, your company's assessment. So when you become more farther down on the maturity curve, you see more of these activities within the supply chain. And then systems and process utilization, because whether or not a company is using spreadsheets or expensive ERP systems, this is an indication of maturity. But you want to be careful in this area because having the system installed doesn't automatically make them very mature. It's the degree to which that system is incorporated into all the activities, all the supply chain activities, the way it's coordinated, and the way that the company obtains information from that to make their key business decisions. I've seen companies that have SAP installed, but they maintain their inventory records on spreadsheets. And they even restrict the access of those spreadsheets to some key supply chain employees. So, having that SAP system, you would think they would be higher up on the maturity curve, but the way they use it really puts them back on the lower end of that curve. And then when the supply chain function itself is recognized as process owners, key stakeholders, people who really have a lot to contribute to the organization, organizations that develop strategies that the rest of their stakeholders know about, that they're working together cross functionally to achieve objectives. These are the ones that are more mature than organizations that are more reactive and wait for direction from management or other stakeholders on what they need to do. The process the organization uses to segment suppliers is another real key to their maturity level. If there is no formal process and review, and or suppliers are ranked solely by the amount of money they receive on a interim basis, whether it's 6 months or a year, then they're really at the lowest level of the maturity curve. When there are regular, formal, even cross-functional reviews of suppliers on multiple criteria, not just the spend, but if they have preferred supplier designations, if they have strategies, again, that are cross functional and that the whole organization is working to implement, then that's the maturity level that's on the far end. That's the more mature organization. When they can drive performance through their supplier segmentation, through their supplier management, that's a higher level of maturity. And segmentation strategies segmentation and strategies have high correlation to supplier risk and supplier relationship management and programs that look out for those. If the risk assessments are not part of supplier vetting from the beginning and part of the business continuity plans, then the maturity of the organization is lower than another organization that has risk and relationship management activities defined, have specific programs to look at those, and established these in an area of the organization where they're maintained and the visibility is clear to everyone. Those are more maturity, farther down the maturity level curve. And I've often been asked, what about size? How many people do you have? Does that help dictate where your maturity level is? It might, in part. A very small organization might keep you from being at the top of the maturity curve, but a small supply chain staff can be made up of only a couple of people, a couple of buyers, primarily focused on converting recs to POs. If that's what you have, then that's what you have. Or you can still have a couple of people, but you have one or more individual with a higher skill set who has that big picture perspective, somebody who can develop and implement strategies, oversee strategic sourcing projects, maybe working on new projects, new product development with the rest of the team, or maybe leading activities with the quality organization so that they can synergize there. It's not really the size of the organization, but the skill levels of the employees and the ability to collaborate with and earn respect from your other internal stakeholders. Finally, if the purchasing function is entrenched in new product development, is seen as a key function in the organization, then you're further on the maturity curve versus being seen as maybe a service organization or structure or embedded as kind of a footnote to the operations or maybe the finance department. So if you have an organization that's emerging, that has their own directors, vice presidents, maybe even a CPO, that's farther down on the maturity curve. And I want to keep in mind that these are not good or bad judgments. These are just distinctions that allow us to place different organizations along the maturity curve to look for opportunities, to look for areas of improvement, and to do an honest assessment. So, without a clear idea on where and how to define a maturity curve for supply chains, I looked at some of the business models that I've shared with you and some others, and I created a matrix that looks something like this. I began to populate the boxes with increasing activity from level 1 to level 5. And this went through a few iterations. I used those 8 criteria, and I started with a little bit different criteria, but ended up with those 8 aspects of supply chain management and said, these are the ones that I think are the most important to an organization. And ultimately, I used a value add assessment to really determine the different step functions or the levels in the model. I settled on 4 levels. Some models I've seen use 5, and you can use what works for you if you're creating your own model, or you can leverage another one. And as I created my model for the org maturity, I broke down those 8 areas into these different levels of detail. And you can see some examples on this slide. So if you were more tactical, more reactive with fewer processes, you were lower toward the low level one end. And if you had supplier SWOT analyses, if you did strategies, development, deployment of strategies, if you did a lot of financial analysis, and if you had, again, leaders that were recognized within the organization, even up to a CPO level, then you were higher on the curve. And I had a lot of detail around that model, but ultimately I ended up with this. So I ended up with value add axis, that's the X axis, and maturity was the bottom one. So I defined the 4 levels as follows. The first one was assurance of supply. This is where organizations are conventional, maybe procurement organizations. You've got a small function that's there, highly transactional, focuses on acquiring the right parts at the right place at the right time. And that's all good stuff. There's nothing wrong with having that level of organizational maturity. If you can do that, then that's a big contribution to the organization. But if you want to go up a level, I looked at the next level where strategic sourcing begins. Cost management is in there and cost reductions, and there's tracking of that, reporting of that. There is some categorization or segmentation of suppliers that's incorporated into the whole organization. And the whole demand management focus has a higher priority. So you start to see some S&OP processes, you see some collaboration between that, some forecasts, and some basic things. And I define that level as procurement, above just a purchasing kind of transactional area. It's actually procuring and some little bit of strategy. The next level up is what we deemed an integrated supply chain. That level probably has a more global perspective, or at least not so much of a local perspective. There's more employees in this area, though they don't have to have large teams, but there is a clear delineation in skill levels, and that's indicated by different job types. For example, if you have buyer, senior buyer, category managers, different levels like that, then that is in this integrated supply chain level. You start to see concepts like Lean and Six Sigma deployed. You look at the way they're managing cost and you see a total cost of ownership approach. Activities in here are supplier assessments on a regular basis, And these include risk relationship management as part of that strategic analysis and planning. So you see a lot more strategy in this level than in the two previous ones. And finally, this is a level where I say this is where I always aspired to be when I worked in the corporate world, and I call it value management. This is where the supply chain function is viewed as a competitive advantage between the organization and its competitors, where customer needs and wants are really well aligned with supplier capabilities. Processes are optimized. They talk about continuous improvement a lot. And the function is able to deliver value add solutions, not just a few dollars or even a lot of dollars in cost reduction. They're really looking at how they can do things differently. They're leading projects and they're considered a valuable part of the organization, not only valuable, but integral and a necessary, important function right up there with engineering and marketing and all of that kind of thing. So those are the four levels. So then I said, okay, this covers really a broad range of activities and philosophies, and that's good because the different elements that I looked at really have a broad range, and that this model should be able to encompass that. I want to keep in mind that the progression through this is a journey. It's unique to each company and organization. If you take an assessment like this in any point in time, you might come up with a different answer. So if you did it a year ago, you might say, okay, here's my assessment. And then if you did it today, you might get a different assessment. So it's important that there's not a right way to do this. There's not a single way to do this. You want to look at this very carefully to say, where are you and is your organization and what can you do in order to move through this maturity? And again, the way this model is constructed, it's really possible and it's really recommended that you look at each of these 8 areas and say, where am I on this curve? And then you can start to draw a picture for yourself that says, okay, in general, I'm in this area. Maybe I'm in the procurement to integrated supply chain. There is no good or bad. This is not a judgment. This is a where am I, an honest assessment, and it's where can I be? So again, I draw the model oftentimes as a chevron, a series of chevrons, because I think they do nest into each other. And if you don't have a lot of maybe the procurement basics, it's a lot harder to get to the integrated supply chain, and it may keep you from getting to that value management area. So what do you have that can be improved to move you from one area to another? Um, you operate on varying levels and you do this simultaneously. So you may be very good in your systems, like you may have SAP, but if you're not using it fully, how could you use it more? What else could you bring in there? And that doesn't mean that you have to go buy another add-on module to that. It just means what functionality is there that you're not taking advantage of. What Start with standard reports. What can I get from the standard reports? What reports am I not looking at that would maybe help me make better decisions? So again, it's a non-judgmental exercise, but it's really important that you're honest with yourself and say, where are you on this continuum? And you want to set goals for continuous improvement, because everyone should have goals for continuous improvement. You don't wait till you get to the value management and say, okay, now we're going to do continuous improvement. If you are at the assurance of supply in some of the areas, that's fine. But if you'd like to move to the procurement area, if you think that would add value to you as an individual, or that would bring value to your company, if that's something that you can lead, that you can champion, that you can bring into the organization, then set some goals and make sure that you're tracking that progress. So organizational maturity is a continuum. This is the model I've created. There's a lot more detail behind it. If you're interested in that, we can talk about that later, but this is something that I wanted to share. And again, moving along this maturity curve is a journey. And there's 8 different aspects in the supply chain model that say, look at all of these areas. How do you go from being very reactive to more proactive? What's the talent level of the employees in your organization? Can you augment that? Can you improve that? Can you enhance that? Think about that when you're making your next hire. How do you do that? How can you leverage other expertise in the organization to bring into that part of it? Do your staff really look at that as buying, or are they looking at as we are sourcers and not sorcerers, but we are sourcing these things and we have responsibilities to do broader sourcing activities, not necessarily for everything you purchase. There's an element of the tactical, convert it direct to the purchase order quickly in every organization. But when does more strategic sourcing come into play? Where would it benefit you and the company from taking those extra steps and doing that extra due diligence on that? So it's a journey, and you're going to be at different places with those different areas. It's not uncommon to see some big disparities amongst those factors. Like I say, you may feel like you're a level 3 pushing a level 4 in one area, but you're still back in a 2, solidly in the 2 area in another factor. So it's okay to do that. Again, be honest, figure out where you want to be, how you can move forward. This model should serve as a reference, as a benchmark. The complexity can be really daunting, and it's easy to simplify it. Don't make it harder than it is. You could spend a lot of time and trying to figure out, am I 2? Am I 3? Am I, I do these, but I don't do these, with this list of activities in there. So what you really want to say is, if you feel solid about the 2, give yourself a 2 plus and say, we'd like to be at the 3 level. And that means incorporating these couple of items into what we do on a daily basis, into our processes, so that we can move ourselves to that 3 level. It's important to set goals for that continuous improvement. And if you don't have those from your leader, then you should set those for yourself, and you can help push those for your organization. Make suggestions, offer to lead projects, offer to do things to make enhancements to the way that you do business. It's important, if you're a manager, to track the progress and report that. Share your good news, share your progress with everyone, because that reflects on yourself as well. And celebrate the improvements with your team. There's lots of ways to celebrate and congratulate people when you feel like you're actually moving forward on this. Ask yourself, where would you like to be this time next year? If you don't do anything different, then you're not going to get a different result. But if you make a few changes, in some cases, it's some tweaks. In some cases, that's bigger projects. But where would you like to be, and what does it take to get you to that level? Just think 6 months ahead, 1 year ahead. How can you move forward? So if you're interested in more discussion of this, or you'd like to see the more detailed model, then you can set up a call with me. You can do callwithjane.com, and I can talk to you about how Purple Link can help your business, give you some access to support and resources that maybe aren't in this presentation, but that I have as reference. And you'll be in touch with experienced and knowledgeable people who know how to handle these issues, have gone through these kinds of things before, can help you assess where you are, and can help you put an action plan together to show you how to get to the next level. Because there is a better way to reduce all of these costs and risks in the supply chain. So dynamic dialogue, that kind of concludes our presentation today. Next time, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about supplier diversity and how that can be a competitive strategy for your organization. We're going to talk in April about a little more global kinds of issues. We're going to talk about, where are all the chips, because we're hearing a lot about all of these electronic chips. It started with the car businesses, but it's expanding to other areas, and it looks like it's going to be a slog for the time being. And then we're going to talk about China and the global trade overview. I still keep hearing a lot about China, and what's good about it, what's not good about it, what can we do about it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then in May, we're going to start in with skills. So I'm going to talk about soft skills. In this venue, I've talked about skills before for supply chain professionals, but on May 11th, we're going to talk about soft skills in particular. I have a workshop beginning on March 29th for the CPSM exam through the ISM organization. If you want to become a certified professional in supply management, you can start this month. Starts the end of the month, and you can register on our website. And hopefully we'll have some more webinars or workshops this spring. So I want to leave you with this thought today. I think the business models can be overwhelming sometimes and a little bit daunting, but when you start to look at the pieces, you can say, no, I really can use this. I know where I am and I know where I can be. So excellence is creativity mixed with maturity and subject to reality. So I thought that was a very good thing to think about for the next couple of weeks. So that's all I have. I'll take questions, comments, any any thoughts anybody wants to share.